So you'll be able to receive a copy of that recording when it becomes available, as well as the slide deck that we're sharing today alongside the narrative of the Insight report. We will be taking questions today, and so there is a chat feature, and please use that chat feature in order to send questions to us, which we will answer at the end of the presentation. We will be holding all questions and answering them at the end of the presentation, but you're welcome to send us questions at any time. And so, without further ado, I'd like to invite my colleagues and friends from the Black Opera Alliance to come on screen. We'll introduce ourselves and get started with the presentation today. First, let me just introduce, again, a good friend and colleague, Dr. Darrell Akon, who is a board member of the Black Opera Alliance and has been deeply involved in our partnership and our work together. Hi, Darrell, good afternoon.
Hi, Jim. Thank you. I'm very excited to be here and to share the next Insight report. I was on the first presentation as well, and so there are some exciting updates, some updates that are a little troubling, and I'm excited to dig into those as well. But I also want to take this time to introduce a colleague of mine, one of the great members of the Black Opera Alliance, and also one of the members of our data team at Black Opera Alliance, in Ibukun Babalola.
Hi, everyone. Excited to be here.
So Jim, I think we can move right into the presentation, and we'll start with Ibukun. We'll talk just a little bit about Black Opera Alliance, our mission, and how we got started.
So Black Opera Alliance was born during the pandemic out of this movement for racial equity and justice, sort of across all industries and in all facets of society. Black opera artists found a need for that within the opera community. And so we got together and put our energy and our hearts together to form this alliance. So the mission of the Black Opera Alliance is to empower Black classical artists and administrators by exposing systems of racial inequality or inequity and underrepresentation of the African diaspora in all facets of the industry, and challenging institutions to implement drastic change. And so we answered the call. We saw a need and realized that we are really stronger together. And when we band together and there's strength in numbers, and we're able to sort of go to our industry, speak to the issues that we see, speak to our experiences, and start making some moves. We started with an open letter to Richard Tucker Foundation, and sort of have gone on from there and have advocated for our own community, have joined with other communities, underrepresented communities, and really seen a great response and a great push forward within the community and also within the industry at large.
Awesome. Thanks, Ibukun. And so, you know, this is great work. So please support us. We just celebrated our 1-year anniversary, and I am just so proud of the progress of the organization, and even prouder of what I see being its future and the effect and impact it has and will continue to have, not only the opera industry, but hopefully the performing arts sector more broadly. And so if you want to support us, you can sign our pledge, and go to blackoperaalliance.org/pledge. That looks differently if you are a leader in the industry at an opera company. Then there's a certain version of the pledge that you can sign to commit yourself and your company to this work. And if you're just a supporter or an ally, you know, or someone wants to be involved, there's another version of the pledge that's in the form of a petition that you can sign using that same link. A second way to support us is to donate. As with any nonprofit organization, especially a young grassroots organization, if you would like to donate to Black Opera Alliance, go to blackoperaalliance.org/donate. And what is an update since the last time we had an Insight report is that we have received 501c3 determination. And so all donations to our organization are tax exempt. And then finally, become an ally, follow our work, comment, like, call out companies, call out, problematic things that are happening in this industry when we highlight them on our several platforms. And our handle is @Black Opera Alliance. Very straightforward. And so I think most folks who know about our work know about this pledge for racial equity and systemic change in opera. It continues to be the centerpiece of our engagement with the industry. This is a pledge that outlined tenets of what we believe to be core to racial equity and that progress in the industry. And we outline some barriers and ask companies to commit to addressing those barriers, right? And so a lot of the work you'll see today, a lot of the data you'll see today is a response to how companies have begun to do that work and how, unfortunately, some companies have chosen not to do that work or chosen to do that work quite poorly. And I think that, the more we really dig into this arena, it's important for us to hold not only the industry accountable, but hold ourselves accountable to telling an honest story. And so that's definitely going to be my goal in today's conversation, is to just be really honest about what I'm discerning from our findings in this data, and also just through the many ways in which I am engaged and BOA is engaged with the industry at large.
And as I said at the top, my name is Jim DeGood. I am a vice president with TRG Arts. We are a data-driven consulting firm, but more importantly, we are partners to the Black Opera Alliance. And I'm really proud that we have the ability to partner with the Black Opera Alliance and to bring the expertise that our firm has in collecting and understanding, evaluating, and presenting data to illuminate the story of what has been happening relative to racial equity and justice in the opera field and where there are opportunities for improvements. And it's been a pleasure to work with Ibukun and other members of the data research team to frame up how we request data, how we receive data, and how we, in fact, illuminate stories out of the data. And I'm glad to be able to work with Darrell and Ibukun to share some of those stories that are emerging out of the data that we've received so far today. The work is not done. And I know that at the end of this presentation, we'll continue to talk with you and others in the field about how our data collection, data interpretation efforts will continue.
Great. I share the enthusiasm around the partnership, and it has been so fruitful, and I'm excited to continue forward. But as with any partnership, with any endeavor, there are always goals and intentions. And so, for the sake of transparency and really framing our conversation and where we are now versus where we hope to end up with this partnership with TRG, it's really about expectations, timelines, and partnership with opera companies. Those are the goals of, what we're really trying to push forward during this period of data collection, of really intentional advocacy around racial equity and justice, as Jim so beautifully put it. I think it's about the metrics, right? For ourselves, for the industry, different commitments, different ways to measure whether or not there is discernible progress, verifiable progress being made in the industry. And that is really the intervention that BOA and TRG are trying to make for the industry.
So this movement was sort of born on social media, and our generation has used social media really well, sort of use it as a tool to share stories and as a tool of accountability. And so that's what we've done. So we're using our social media, primarily our Facebook and our Instagram, to communicate with our community and also with the industry at large, to communicate with them about the status of the pledge, namely the status of companies who have signed on to the pledge or who are in progress or who has not responded. So we use green, yellow, and red, which are, really identifiable colors. It's sort of, you see it and you sort of have a connotation about what they mean. So green means, yes, these companies have signed on to the pledge, they're on board. Right now, we're at 48% of companies that we've sent the pledge to have said yes. 35% are in the yellow card category. So those are the ones who are in progress. They're either reworking the wording of the pledge to fit their specific needs for their companies, or just otherwise in talks with BOA in order to get to a point where they can sign the pledge. We're at 16% no responses. That's actually a recent social media push that we have put a spotlight on the companies that have not responded to the pledge at all. And we're happy to say that almost if not all of the companies that we have highlighted as being non-responsive have responded and are either in progress or fully green. So that is good news. And then 1% of the companies that we have signed, that we have sent the pledge to, are a red card, which means that it is explicitly clear that they will not be signing on, which is disappointing. But none of that is set in stone. So the door is always open, and we are welcoming and inviting these companies to change their minds and get on board. The work will continue. And so the opportunity is always open for them to join in. Just like with those non-responses, they got the call from us and from the community at large, and they got on board. So we're hoping that 1% will go away.
Indeed. And in fact, in the data that you're sharing with us, Ibukun, it's important, I think, for us to highlight that the data that we're sharing today is as of late July. And even in your description of the status of pledge commitments, we're seeing movement in the month of August. This is the second of a series of many insight reports. And so as we have more data and as that data is interpreted, the updated data will be released in future webinars and future insight reports as well. So let's focus in then and tell more stories out of the data that we have as of the end of July. So 84 companies received a request to complete workbooks from Black Opera Alliance. And of those 84 companies, 34 companies are represented in the study today. That's 40% of the population that received a workbook. Now, 19 companies returned data to Black Opera Alliance themselves. That's 23% of the population that received workbooks. Another 15 companies did not return workbooks, but instead Black Opera Alliance members completed those workbooks as much as they could on behalf of the companies. And so you'll see two colors represented in this first chart. The green are self-reported, companies returning workbooks themselves. The teal color represents workbooks that were completed by Black Opera Alliance members. And you can see there's a relationship here between whether I have signed the pledge, denoted by a Y for yes, IP is in progress, NR is not responsive as of the end of July, and N is that one no company. So that teal section where BOA members have attempted to report on the practices of the less participatory companies stands out to me. That's an interesting data point.
Oh, absolutely. You know, I think for me, there are a couple things. One is that it's unfortunate that BOA has had to step forward completely for all of the non-responsive companies, because an interesting narrative that exists in the industry is that a lot of these companies are non-responsive or are reluctant to sign on to something like a pledge like ours because they're already doing the work, quote unquote. That phrase is something you'll hear so ubiquitously in the industry. They're doing the work. And it's clearly, if they were doing the work, these workbooks, they would be able to fill out these workbooks with a relative ease, and that's clearly not happening. And it's a little disheartening to me, but it's not surprising. And my biggest thing about this chart is it really pushes forth something I've begun to be more explicit about with general directors and other stakeholders in the industry, is that this is going to happen with or without you. You know, we're going to get the workbooks from you and pull data that way, or we're going to go out and get it. Because I think traditionally we've given too much power to those who are already in the seats of authority. And when we do that, we sort of perpetuate these systems where they can do this work when they feel like it, and like back out of this work when they are no longer feeling like it, or if the pressure becomes too strong, as we will see in some of these other data sets later in this presentation, where companies are quite literally emphasizing the parts of their data, the parts of this work, the parts of engagement with how we're doing this work that show their companies in a good light, and very strategically omitting the parts of this work that, you know, would do the opposite, which is an unfortunate approach.
Well, a theme of this insight report is not necessarily the data, but one of the major themes is the absence of data and what the absence of data tells us. So not only is that evident here in the proportion or the percent of workbooks that have been returned, but it's also prevalent in the level of completeness when we have received workbooks back from companies. The second chart shows us that when we receive workbooks back, whether they're from companies directly or from Black Opera Alliance members, only 41% of all of the information that we've requested is complete and usable for insight, which I think in and of itself is also telling, Darrell, based on the observation that you just had. We at TRG work with data all the time, request data from our clients all the time, and inevitably there are sections of data requests that are forgotten or skipped over or subordinated for other purposes. But 41% completeness really stands out to me as something we rarely see.
Yeah, and you know, I'm going to stop myself from being too provocative here, but you know, in addition to your own experiences with TRG, I also happen to be someone who has connections with Opera America, and I know they've sent out data, some data like collection that's rather similar to ours, and they got completion rates at a much higher rate, like really awesome rates actually. And I think it would be important for us to take a real hard, honest look at what the differences are between who's asking for the data and what the data is, how it's being framed. And I think that'll give you all the information you need in terms of how this worked, even as so many companies and individuals and leaders perform advocacy, is what I'm starting to call it. You know, it really, the proof is in the pudding, and like, what are people actually doing? What are you actually committed to this work, giving us holistic data sets? Are you actually just doing enough to get your company in the in progress category, or get your company on a list of companies that have participated in some way? You know, it really is, it's an unfortunate thing for us to have to like kind of navigate now, because now we have this muddied space where it's no longer about, is this company participating or is this company not participating, but rather, is this company giving us the information we're requesting? Are they cherry picking what they think is going to make them look good? And Jim, I would love if you speak briefly, what you used this phrase that I love, passive participation, which I think is so relevant to what we're seeing here.
Yeah, sure. So, you know, when we look at the completion of data that we received back, it's really evident to me, especially when we look at the Y column, the yes column. These are companies that have committed to sign the pledge, that have signed the pledge, in fact. And if you look at the chart on the left, all of those companies self-reported data back to the Black Opera Alliance. The chart on the right says that even though all of the companies that sent data back have signed the pledge and it's self-reported data, you can clearly see that there is hold back from total transparency into the way that the business operations and the hiring practices at those companies operates today, especially related to how we perceptually assign race to the artists that we employ. And so I know that Ibukun, you and Darrell will talk more about the importance of supplying that data later in the presentation. But what stands out to me here is the places where we have the most complete data are the places where Black Opera Alliance team members have advanced the work themselves.
Yeah. Which is, I really want to highlight that. I mean, we're like this new small grassroots organization in an industry with institutions, some of which having, budgets of $15 million plus and hundreds of employees and so much more infrastructure and like networks and ways in which they can engage with each other and general director calls and I'm sure text threads and group chats and email threads and all of these things. And yet this industry, even in the wake of what a lot of folks are calling a racial awakening, is allowing this small grassroots organization to take on the bulk of this data collection, even as we have curated these processes by which you can engage with us and provide us the information we need to continue to do this work for the industry. Even that very small ask of an entry point is not being treated fairly, honestly, if we're being super honest. It's not a fair approach right now. And because companies know that we as a small organization of all Black folks in this industry that is so white supremacist does not have requisite power to actually do much to hold them accountable to engaging with us in the ways in which we want them to engage with us. But I mean, I guess my message to the industry is that we do have power. And it may not look exactly how we have seen power wielded in this industry, but we will continue to use all of our networks to continue to build our infrastructure and tell these stories honestly and authentically and hold folks accountable. And so if you're listening to this, please just hop on the train authentically and like help us out, because we really are, putting in a lot of work to get this done, because it's important to our membership, and it really is important by extension to the entire industry.
Yeah, indeed. Because data completeness or the lack of data completeness is a major theme, we wanted to study, we wanted to understand the data that we did receive back that did have race designations assigned to artists. What is the relationship between the level of data completeness and the artists that are being hired? And what we see in the data is in fact some bias, even in the way that we're returning data. This chart it's just one axis. First, focus on the blue line. The blue line is the percentage of data that is complete or has classified race categories against artists that are hired. So all the way over to the left, those are 1% complete. If you are 0% complete, you're not in this data set. All the way over to the right, you can see data completeness jumps up to 92%. No one company returned workbooks to us with 100% of data and races assigned to artists in those workbooks. The second line, the teal line, that if you squint your eyes, you can see there's a downward trend correlation, is really fascinating to me, especially the first spike at 1% data completeness. The data that was supplied shows that we're hiring 60% of the artists are Black in our company. The second spike up, where you can start to see just before the blue line creeping up, that's still only about 4.5% data completeness. That company reported 34% of the artists that they hire are Black. what about all the other artists that weren't assigned? There's already a little bit of performative bias in the data that we're receiving back, with companies giving us the data that shows that they are hiring Black artists, but withholding data that shows that they perhaps are not hiring Black artists. And this chart really stood out to us as emphasizing some of the decisions and choices that might be being made by companies as they're completing those workbooks.
Right. You know, when we were getting these graphs back at first, once this first wave of data collection and analysis was being done, and we were in meetings looking at the data, one thing that I said more than once was, this almost looks a little too good to be true. When we sort of set the numbers up against our experiences and the experiences of our colleagues, something didn't look quite right. And then looking at this graph, it sort of all brought it into focus. It all made sense. And again, yeah, it really does speak to a sort of passive, I wouldn't even call it commitment, because you can't really be passive about commitment, but a passive participation, you know, and sort of, I think I want to emphasize that, you know, what we're doing is not for show. It's not to make us feel better about what we're doing, but it's to see where we actually are so that we know where we need to go. And it's really important work that we're doing. And so for me, it is disappointing to see sort of this bias come through. I think it doesn't help anyone to sort of skew the data and make things look better than they are, because then we won't know where we need to go. And I think if we're going to commit to this work, then we need to commit wholeheartedly. And so this graph was disappointing. And so I hope that as we continue, as we get more complete data, as we get more earnest participation, then we'll get a better idea of where we really are, so we can have a better idea of the work that needs to get done, and we can work more efficiently that way.
Indeed. Focusing now on the data that we do have and representing the data that we do have some companies that have assigned perceptual race data to the artists that they've hired. And again, if we relate that data to the status of the signing of the pledge, on its face, it appears that the companies that have signed the pledge are hiring a greater proportion of Black artists than those that have not. In this chart, you can see the proportion of artists hired by the race categories that are presented in those data collection workbooks that the Black Opera Alliance distributed. The blue stripe where there is a percentage label is the stripe that represents Black artists. And a reminder that in our first Insight report, the goal is for companies to hire in such a way that their hiring decisions represent the communities that they serve. Because this is an aggregate overview of the national trends, we related these practices back to the fact that 12% of Americans nationally are Black, related from the last census report. So the yes category is slightly better than the national trend. But again, the goal is not to get to 12%, it's to get to the level of representation of your individual company's community that you're serving. And yet on its face, the 13% seems good, question mark?
Yeah, for me, no. Because, mostly in consideration of what we just discussed. And that we know that what we're getting back is already biased, cherry-picked data. And so even that data, and we also know that, some of our companies that are from some of these populations that have higher percentages of Black folks, are some of our yeses. And so it would be a safe assumption, and of course we can go back and check the numbers to know this for sure, that our yes category, that percentage of Black folks should actually be larger than 13%, given the companies that exist in that category. And I think for me, like just thinking about the fact that the data we're getting back is biased and like almost false, and to still see that in progress and no non-responsive, or non-responsive is actually BOA. And so that of these charts, that is probably the most honest representation of where we actually stand, which is it's hard to really take in. And I just want to call folks' attention, like, let's look at this non-responsive category. These are folks who, you have this grassroots organization of almost 1,000 Black artists and administrators willing to put in the work, devote resources and time resources and financial resources to building out this process. And they have chosen not to respond to the call, and yet these are the truths of what they're doing, right? And even beyond Black, we see 6% Black, but even if you look at that entire non-white category, it's still at what, 15%? It's just like of non-white folks who hold roles in this industry. And you'll see when we talk about roles, we're not only talking about artistic, like roles, character roles, we're talking about all roles in the industry, artistic production, being on the stage, being behind the scenes, all of those roles. Generally, the most honest data we have is telling us that only 15% are of folks who are non-white. And I think it should give all of us pause.
Yeah, well, let's go directly where you're referencing, Darrell, which is with the production level data. We did ask companies to provide the number of people that it takes to put on an opera production, the roles that they fulfill, and then to assign perceptual race categories to each of those artists. This is how, in the data that we received back, the opportunities for employment across all of the opportunities weighted out. So again, because it's incomplete data, we know that it's not every role that goes into mounting an operatic production, but really we want to focus on the two that represent the most opportunity for any artist. And those are in the artistic production realm and certainly in the principal singer realm. And when we look at the race data that we received back across all of the roles in the pie chart, but especially related to the two slices of pie that represent the largest opportunity, here we see that with artistic production, Black artists represent 2 to 3% of all of the artists that were hired. And in principal singer roles, only 10% of those roles go to Black artists.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that it's self-explanatory that, when we talk about performativity, right, what even though 10% is like still below where we need to be, below the national average, even given all of these stories on the backs of Black labor, on the backs of Black trauma, Black pain, and so many of these operas, that's where principal roles stand. But like even more troubling is this artistic production. Those are the leaders in the industry. Those are the decision makers. And Black folks, we're a minority, but we are probably the most storied minority in America, and certainly in opera and in terms of the stories we see on stage. And so it is really, really a problem that so little of that producerial space, that authoritative space, is occupied by folks from the African diaspora.
Yeah, indeed.
Right. And I think when we're talking about diversity and representation, I think it's important to think past just sort of the total representation of Black people, but also where are you finding those Black people, right? So the data is not that it's 10% in artistic. production and 3% on stage. It's the opposite. We tend to find Black artists in performing roles, in roles that really they're workers in the companies, and the people who are making the decisions, the people who are in charge tend to not be Black. And so that's something to think about too. It's not just how many Black people are there total in the company, but where are we finding our Black people? And that's really something to consider when you're considering diversifying your company. It should be across all roles in the company and not just the front-facing ones.
Yeah, indeed. I would note that we are in partnership with Opera America. We'll be reporting on the diversity or lack of diversity that opera companies represent in their administrative staffs and on their boards in a future insight report. So not only will we be looking at on-stage opportunities for leadership and equity, but also off-stage as well. Related to that point,
Bernetta's point, I was just going to say, I saw the sheet, so in a future, we have some of that data, but we'll report on it more publicly in a future insight report once we have more holistic data.
Yeah, thank you, Darrell. All right, so we did ask opera companies also to report back how they're holding themselves accountable to finding more opportunity for equity, and gave a couple of accountability mechanisms to choose from. Here, we only had 19 companies of the larger set of companies that return data to us respond. Of those companies, 3 left this question blank. But where we did receive answers to accountability, the highest responses were in hiring a third-party consultant, of adopting some kind of alternative approach that isn't represented here, or leveraging ad hoc, read volunteer, staff level involvement in advancing equity.
Yeah, I was struck by the most prevalent answers being sort of the vaguest ones. And Darrell and I found ourselves asking, what is alternative? What is the alternative approach? Especially when there are so many options available to choose from. It really does beg the question, what other approach is there? And again, it speaks to a general vagueness in the responses that we get, which is, a bit troubling, at least to me.
Yeah. In addition, it strikes me that I am surprised that board-led committees wasn't among the highest level of response, and that ad hoc staff level committees are represented equally with board-led, says that these companies are not asking their board to hold them accountable for advancing this work, that the board might not necessarily see it as its view or purview relative to governance to hold the company accountable to make progress toward equity. And I think I have questions around the third-party consultants. Who is employing them, the executive director or the board? What parameters are those third-party consultants being given relative to advancing equity within the company? And to whom do they report back? Who is how is that third-party consultant's findings being enacted and animated within the company if the board is not an active leading participant of the progress?
And that's a really, really important point, Jim, because what it gets at is the difference between an authentic commitment on behalf of an organization to a cause, to a value, versus a situational response to a problem, which would be handled at the administrative level, right? And we're seeing so much of the latter, which gives folks who have seen this happen, not only in opera, but in larger pockets of advocacy, where the majority group, the majority spaces, privileged spaces respond in the moment just to get themselves out of trouble without actually self-reflecting and trying to correct systemic problems. And it's this is stuff that a lot of us know to be true, but it's really interesting for folks to be held to account using data as evidence.
Yeah. Going back to the point that Ibukun, you made around Black artists being hired as workers relative to the principal singer role, relative to the chorus and other roles that we know that Black artists are being hired for, we also ask these companies to report on the training that they offer other artists who help Black artists present well on stage, and what level of training those companies are offering these designers and technicians to ensure that Black artists represent well and they're able to be seen as well as beautifully heard on stage in all the ways that we want them to be seen. And what struck me is that this wasn't 100%. Even though only 19 companies answered this question, we didn't get 100% participation in any one of these training areas. And in fact, we had more companies leave this question blank than the previous question.
Right. This was one of the slides that I looked at and said, that seems a little too good. And we're talking about, at most 11, lighting designers are being reported to, be trained to light Black singers. And I'll be honest, I've never seen one in my experience. I have never worked with a makeup artist that specifically knew how to put makeup on my skin. And so seeing that there are 10 was surprising because I've never seen one. And so that was a little shocking to me, but I also was shocked by the fact that this question is also quite vague, in that there's no specification on what the training is. It really is just a yes or no question. And so then again, it was surprising that it was left blank when there really wasn't much to answer other than yes or no. And so, yeah, this was one of the slides that I could tell right away was probably skewed.
What's interesting, Ibukun, is that when we were reviewing this data, I noted that one company said that the stage directors had not yet received this training because they weren't in residence yet, but they would when they got there. And because we wanted to err on the side of generosity, I took that to mean, yes, they would receive training. And so therefore that company is represented in the yeses here. But again, perhaps erring on the side of giving the benefit of the doubt is overstating the level of training that is being given right now.
Yeah, I think when we set, we're talking about stage directors. So if we were generous in evaluating that 9 stage directors are trained and specifically working with Black artists, and we set that against the 19 total workbooks that we've gotten, the 34 that were sent out, the 84 that are part of this complete data set, to say that 9 is a general estimate or is a generous estimate is really, really quite telling. And I think across the board, a lot of we have erred on the side of generosity, and we're still seeing these low numbers. And so I think that's something really, I think that should be taken to heart.
And one thing, that I'm just moved to say here, because I feel like with every slide, we're looking at the slide and we're, saying it's troubling or it's this or it's this. And that feels to be directed at the general directors and the decision makers, like, do better. But I also want to just offer a message to, like, everybody else, like the activists out there, like the allies, the singers, the performers, board members, and that, like, what are we going to do if they don't do better, right? Are you going to be with us if assuming this movement continues to escalate, continues to heat up, because we're not going to let off pressure, because this is not just this opera is doing a poor job at this. This is like injustice. Like that's what we're seeing. It's injustice. These are the careers of hundreds, thousands of folks who are a part of a system that, even relative to our already white supremacist society, is even more homogenous, even more disparate in terms of who has access to resources. And so I just want to, send out signals to both of those crowds, because I'm going to be honest and say that I grow a little pessimistic about the willingness of the leaders at present to respond in a way that is substantive and sufficient.
Right.
So in progress, last time we did an Insight report, we talked about this category because it included such a broad variety of types of companies. Like some companies could say like, oh, I got your pledge, we're thinking about it, and that was in progress, versus another company that we knew we were going to get a pledge tomorrow that they were like getting reviewed by their board, but that was also in progress, or a company that sent us something that was not sufficient that was also in progress. And so I just wanted to update that has changed a little bit, now that we're further along. In progress really is starting to be only those companies that we know are on the path toward signing the pledge. Like there are certain companies right now, for example, in this category, who have not been in touch with us for months. And similar to the way that we reached out and sort of, publicly advertised which were the companies that were non-responsive, we will of course be in touch with these in progress folks, but then start a similar movement of really moving them either into the green category, into the red category, and really letting this space only be occupied by those companies from whom we're hearing in the moment, and probably even putting a time limit on how long a company can reside in the in progress status. So next steps, Ibukun, do you want to start from your point of vantage, and I can give some more global ones?
Sure. So, of course, we are continuing with our data collection, inviting more companies to participate and complete their workbooks and send it back to us. One hiccup that we did run into is companies not really knowing how to report the race of their artists. And so we want to reiterate, and Jim and Darrell have stated before, we are looking for, Jim used a really nice word. I can't remember what exactly it was, perceptual. Yeah. Right, so we're wanting perceptual race data, which is rather than self-reported, which is how an artist would see themselves, we're wanting companies to report on how they would see and respond to artists. When we're talking about race, we're talking about race as the sort of perceptual social construct that sort of drives how you are seen, perceived, and therefore treated. And so we want this data to reflect how companies are seeing their artists rather than how artists see themselves. Right. And so it's a little bit of a difference. It's not like a census. It's more of a we want it to be the company's perception and how they engage with artists.
Just to layer in there, what I try to tell folks is that we're not trying to trace the individual experiences of BIPOC artists in the field. We're trying to trace the behaviors of companies relative to those individuals. So in order to do that, we would need to know how companies are perceiving those artists. And I would even say, Ibukun, you're being generous in saying that companies are confused on how to do it. Like we've told them what to do, and they're choosing not to do that. And it gets back to this. What is this alternate approach to equity? And the only thing we can come up with in our conversation is like these people, these leaders, assuming that they know more than consultants, than BOA, than all the other organizations that are pushing for racial equity. And I think this is another area where even as we've done this work, we're working with, a really prominent, awesome data collection firm. We have specialists within our own organization, even bring all of that process to these workbooks. there are still leaders coming back thinking that they, usually male, usually older, usually white, know more about how to approach doing this work, even though they are part of the demographic that has perpetuated the same inequity for decades. It's just really mind-boggling dynamic.
Yeah. And I feel led to add, and I sort of mentioned it earlier, but this work, we're not here to make ourselves feel better. This isn't a self-improvement space. Black artists have been part of this industry. Black artists and artists of color have been part of this industry, have enriched this industry. We're here, we're not going anywhere. We're taking up our space because we deserve it and we've earned it. And we are telling the industry that the industry has not done right by us. And so this is an opportunity. What we're seeking is justice, is for the industry to do right by us, to love us back for all that we have poured into this art form. We're asking for our just due, and so this is an opportunity to right wrongs, and to do right by the artists that enrich the work that you produce, and who enrich the work that your companies produce and make your companies better. And so I think reframing it that way, reframing it as, this is not to make ourselves better, but to do right by the people who are giving their time, their labor, their heart. Opera is such an intimate art. It is such an art of the soul, of the heart. We pour so much into it. And so that deserves a level of respect that we have not been getting. So this is an opportunity to start to do right by your artists.
Yeah. And I, if I can, that's so beautiful, Ibukun. And it's like, Black artists are, yes, the most disproportionately affected by the injustice, but the entire industry deserves justice. Like when anybody suffers, when any segment suffers, when any demographic suffers, the entire art form suffers. And we're not getting an opera that is authentic. We're not getting an approach to this art form that has been powerful and world-changing for centuries. We're not giving it its full throat because we are instead letting ourselves linger in inequity and injustice. And so this is for all of us. We just happen to be the folks on whose backs this advocacy, this activism must be played, which sadly is a refrain in American society.
Looking at time, I see some questions coming in. I'd like to, if it's okay, have some time to address some of those questions. And Seamus asks, in fact, picking up on what you were just describing, Ibukun, with the lack of data coming in, Seamus asks, I might have missed this, but when were the workbooks sent out to collect the information? I want to check with my own company to see if we submitted it or not. And this may relate to a next step relative to data collection as well.
Yeah, so the books have been sent out over the last several months. And so if your company, I don't know, from which company Seamus comes, but if it's a company that is a yes, like in the green, it was one of the first companies to receive a workbook. And so that would have been probably 3 months ago now. And some companies as recently as a month ago have received workbooks because there was an approach where we made a strategic decision to focus on those getting workbooks who have said yes, and then having our team start to fill out workbooks for those companies from whom we did not expect workbooks because they had been up until now non-responsive. But even those companies, as of right now, I think I'm correct in saying that all companies have received workbooks, even if we have begun some of those workbooks for them.
All right, Nicholas asks, are there plans to release or to share the names of companies who have, 1, signed the pledge, and or 2, submitted data? As an arts worker, colleague, consumer, I want the opportunity to hold these companies that I patronize and donate to account.
Right. So the status of whether or not they've signed the pledge, you can find, we're naming them by name on our Instagram. So those are those green, yellow, and red cards. And so, yeah, so we are naming the companies who have signed, are in progress, or have said no. And there are a couple of red cards on our Instagram. I'm not sure when we are planning. Darrell, you can speak to sort of
Yeah.
the data and when we're doing that.
Yeah, and as Ibukun said, that's on our Instagram now, and even beyond that, like now that we're entering the stage where we are down, you saw that we had 15%, I think, on the slide of non-responsive companies. I would say that number is below 10% now. Like that's how rapid the movement has been as we've started this more aggressive social media accountability. And so now that that number is down so low, we are also planning to house a portal on our website, blackopperalliance.org, that shows the status of every company, where you could be able to like click on a company, see, where they are, whether they signed the pledge, all kinds of things about that company, a profile. The data, whether or not a company has filled out a data collection workbook, is something we're still in conversation about how to hold companies accountable for that if we do, because that's actually technically not something that's not a requirement of our pledge. And it's something that, for example, Jim spoke earlier to this data collection that Opera America is doing. And so some companies have given us parts of what they've already done for Opera America. There have been other conversations that are very nuanced of why companies feel that in this particular moment, they need to take a couple more steps before they're willing to reach out to their staff or reach out to their boards with more surveying, whether that's turnover that's anticipated or feel like they're over asking of their workers, of their boards. And so, with all of that in mind, we don't really, dissimilar to the pledge where it's like, it's very clear you've signed, you told us you're about to sign or you haven't signed, versus, data collection where we're going to get the information one way or the other. And we hope companies come on board. But even if they don't, you will see the data for these companies, whether from BOA or from them directly.
All right. We have
And
time.
if I may add, oh, sorry. Are we out of time?
Almost, Ibukun. Go ahead.
I just wanted to add real quick, if I can encourage you to, if you're dealing with companies in your own community, ask them directly. That's something that I, as an artist, have started to do, as well as my colleagues. The last time I did a live audition, I sent them an email and asked what their progress on the pledge was. And I think social media can sometimes feel a little vague and maybe ignorable if you just like turn off the app. But if they're getting pressure from their communities directly, I think that can be really impactful and really powerful. So I want to encourage you to do that as well.
All right, we have two more questions that I'm going to advance to the Black Opera Alliance team offline. And we can answer in follow-up to this webinar. If you have other questions, Darrell and Ibukun, where can participants send those questions to have them answered by your team?
Please send any questions or inquiries or comments or call outs or whatever to info@blackopperalliance.org. info@blackopperalliance.org.
Wonderful. So we'll follow up with those questions that are unanswered today. We'll close those loops with you. And if you have additional questions that address that Darrell just shared with you. Again, thank you for joining our webinar today. A recording and a copy of the deck that we reviewed together will be distributed after today, along with the full insight report. And we appreciate you joining us. We appreciate the questions, and we look forward to you helping us advance equity as this process moves forward. Have good days, everyone.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Ibukun.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Darrell.